All right, so we're at 1:35. I think we can get started. Oh, quick test of the mic. Can y'all hear me? I can definitely hear me. That's pretty good speakers in here. Yeah, that was the longest break I've had in a while in between sessions, but I think we've all seen as we've moved back to in-person conferences, we kind of forget that it takes time to swap computers, and it seems that here they've kind of remembered that, so made this much easier. Anywho, thank you all for coming today. I will be discussing more on the topic of API governance that you've all been hearing about at plenty of other sessions today, I'm sure. In particular, I'm going to focus on developer tooling. Basically for teams that are at that point that you have to establish API governance, what are the newer solutions to make the whole process of actually enforcing, both establishing and enforcing API governance to operate much more smoothly at your company. So let me first go through my most hated slide in presentation, the About Me, which is basically I work on APIs a lot. What I'm most well known for is Box. I was basically the first full-time hire for the developer platform over there. I also worked on the developer platform at Tradeshift. Those are the two billion-dollar companies I'm allowed to talk about. But as a consultant, I've helped many now unicorn companies launch successful API programs. I've also helped many companies as they grow beyond that to, after the basic challenge of just having a successful API, having that challenge of scaling as your company grows. As you get to that point where you have many teams working on many APIs, no matter how good they are at designing APIs, if you don't have some sort of plan in place, these APIs are going to get disjoint and difficult to use. So the focus again today is more on tooling. There are plenty of other good talks today on general strategy for API governance, and I'll get into a little bit of that. But I just want to set a base for the principles that we want to establish when you're just launching a successful API program before you run into the challenges for scale. In other talks, I highlight how it's gotten easier and easier to provide a good developer experience because of the tools around OpenAPI and other API standards. We can now auto-generate our documentation. We can auto-generate our libraries and code samples. We can even take a database schema and auto-generate an OpenAPI schema and simply create an API right off of our own database, which is awesome, but not something that I like to highlight when it comes to external APIs. Let's look at these tools and focus on what is commonly referred to as design first principles for external APIs. What I used to call product-driven principles, basically applying product management process to your APIs, determining what is the real purpose of your APIs. Are they for customers to build integrations with their own existing internal tools? Is it for partners who are trying to build enhancements to your functionality? Is it for partners who are trying to bring your functionality into their apps? What are the developers going to build with your APIs? And then how do you make it as easy as possible for them to do so? That involves not just taking your database and making APIs out of that, but designing your APIs according to use case. And with the Magic of OpenAPIs and with the right tools, we can do that as well. We now have tools to basically operate as IDEs for APIs, help us to design our APIs, let us know if we're violating any RESTful standards. And then for the developer experience, there's tools to auto-generate your libraries and SDKs. So we're providing now tools to cover the full product lifecycle of planning, designing, implementing, and launching your APIs. But that's not the focus today. Let's just assume that you're at a company that's done this already. They've applied design first principles and you have a nice streamlined process of making sure that your APIs are aligned with RESTful standards and are use case based. And then you grow. And you go from having one team working on all the APIs to many teams working on all the APIs. Then a new challenge arises, consistency. Individual teams may launch quality APIs, perhaps at different qualities. But even if, in theory, every team is designing the APIs well, they're not going to align. And then as an external developer, if I come along and I'm trying to build an app that works with multiple products of yours, the output of one API isn't going to work with the input of another API without some extra code. It becomes a hassle, and you're actually highly unlikely often to find any developer who can build an app across your multiple products until you work on resolving this. So we can see how designing APIs at scale is more than just designing APIs for usability. What happens when the APIs can start to get disjoint as you just grow? This is something that we've been seeing for well over a decade for web APIs. There are people here from Google who shared their experiences going well over 10 years back when they encountered this challenge. I remember 13 years ago building an integration with Google Docs, Google Sheets, and Google Slides. I was at Box and we were just sending files to Google Docs, Google Sheets, and Slides and getting the files back. And it was different code for each of those because they actually had different APIs. Now in Google's case, it was also the consequence of acquisitions. Google Spreadsheets used to be iRose, Google Docs used to be Writely. So these were companies that start off with their own APIs. Fundamentally, they were going to get disjoint, but Google saw the challenge and started to work towards how do you get the teams to have autonomy while having consistency across APIs. So if I'm building apps with many Google products, how do we get that to work together? This challenge has grown, I think, actually over the last few years. And you'll hear stories from people at Microsoft today and Google, bigger perhaps than the examples I'm highlighting here, the companies that may not already be at 30,000 employees plus, but the companies who just in the last 3 or 4 years had gone from being unicorns to decacorns and suddenly had this challenge of multiple teams working on APIs. Maybe as they grew, they acquire companies, and fundamentally they were going to have disjoint APIs. I'd seen this quite a bit over the last few years, several companies reaching out to me saying, Jeremy, we need help here. Like, we took the principles for design first APIs, but like we just grown unexpectedly, and the API experience is too much of a challenge. And yes, disclaimer, that is how the challenge has grown with the rise in stock valuations of tech companies. Yes, that slide is about 9 months old right now. But during COVID and remote work, we saw this surge. Companies unexpectedly had this demand for APIs. And you know what, even as stocks tanked for, I think, all of these companies actually, at least the ones that are already public, the need for APIs hasn't actually declined. So they're doing that in their stock market. But anywho, for those companies that are running in this challenge now recently, there's an opportunity to make this process smooth now. Because for those who worked at Google and Microsoft and had to do it later, it was a much bigger challenge. And let's look at what you can do sooner than later and the tools to make this easier. First, let's get into the principles. We understand that fundamentally it's just not easy to get alignment across different teams. We know that you can no longer, once this happens, once you have those many teams, have one team defining the APIs for everyone. Fundamentally, you need to allow each product team to design their own APIs. But you need some sort of a process that will give them the autonomy to plan their own APIs, to still make sure they're aligned in some way for consistency. So this is about establishing standards and getting alignment on the standards. So you need to really understand what it takes to establish the standards that each team can use such that they have that authority, but going beyond those RESTful principles, they're going with some specific other requirements that you realize your company needs to make sure that the APIs are aligned. And we'll get into a few examples of what those are, but we know that there have been some other talks specifying exactly where the standards need to be. Now, we can define those requirements, but there's also this challenge of actually getting the teams to use them. I'll talk a little bit about how the standards should be established, but it's not just about the process of establishing the standards, it's the process of getting people to adopt the standards. Maybe enforcement, I prefer to call it something else. And then in practice, to really make this work, it is important to have an ongoing relationship between all the teams and have them share more and communicate more to maintain that alignment as your company grows. Let's talk more about establishing the standards and also doing it in a manner that doesn't force things on anyone. Americans are big on the statement, no taxation without representation. And I find this is highly applicable to API standards. We need teams to both have the autonomy to design their own APIs, but if we're going to set standards for consistency, allow any team that's working on an external API to actually have a say and what these standards are going to be. Fun historic fact, by the way, regarding that quote, if you actually look up early days of the country's history and actually the American Revolution, General Cornwallis, he was the commander of the British forces during the American Revolution. If you look at any of his writings, I've gone through them, there's no mention of API standards. Think about it. Anywho, so we are emphatic here that the API Council needs to be one way or another egalitarian. It's easier said than done, but starting off with a smaller team, you can do this pretty easily by just making sure any team that's working on external API has the right to engineering leadership, and product management representation in an API council. So whatever you've established as your standards, anyone has the right to question the standards, ask questions about the standards, share their feedback on those standards. So they'll agree to abide by them as long as they have the say. But we do still need to enforce those standards, and that's when we get into linters. This is really the most central tool, I'd say, when it comes to enforcement of an API standard. The basics being, if you've ever used something like SmartBear Swagger Hub or Stoplight.io, I'm sure most people here have tried this, the API editors, the IDEs, they'll let you know if your API designs are violating an OpenAPI requirement. Well, these can actually be customized to give you errors and warnings if they're violating anything else that you want to enforce. You want to make sure to have camel case in your endpoint definitions. You want snake case in your query parameters. You can enforce these automatically. I'm still hesitant to use the term force for enforcement, and instead recommend that these tools be promoted as just a means of making it easier to abide by the standards that all teams have a say in. I rarely see teams pushing back on linters, seeing it as force them to do something, but rather most teams are happy to align to standards as long as they have a say and as long as it's easy for them to do it. This is where the linter comes in. If you have an API that's already aligned with the standards, but you want to make sure as you're updating it, you don't accidentally violate it, will these things fit in your CI/CD pipeline? So a developer can automatically be warned when they've added a new endpoint that there's an issue with the standard before it goes live, before anyone takes a look. There are very few manual steps here. They just catch it and they move on. Before the linter, I'd seen at many companies, there's that API review board, but that can be tedious. And even if you have it, it's a manual process both for the team to release their APIs and for the team reviewing. It's difficult for everybody. It may make sense to still have that manual review, but it's nice the majority of issues are just caught instantaneously, and whoever implemented it can just see right away what they need to fix. And for those building an entirely new API, planning a new big version update, if you're using Stoplight or SmartBear, an API editor tool, well, the linter can warn you if there's a standards violation before you even implement your APIs. If you just design it first, you'll know if there's an issue before you write any code for it. So taking this, and linters have actually gotten more flexible over time, such that once you establish your standards, you can define it very thoroughly through a linter and then apply it automatically for designs and for updates to your APIs. Then there's just supporting the principle of sharing among your teams. We can talk about casing, endpoint namings, parameter namings. In practice, the bulk of API consistency, if the intent is to make sure that your developer community can easily work with APIs across products, it's a little difficult, if searching in one API is done differently from another. It's a little difficult if some parameters are snake case versus some camel case. But if you're taking the output of one API and you have to do a transformation to use another API, that's the big pain. So if there's anything you want to do in standardization, it's to try to get teams to use the same underlying models for your endpoints as much as possible. And to do so, it's best to establish in your standards certain reusable models and make it easy for teams to plan to use those models. So I'm designing a new API, I can get auto suggestions for existing models that our teams have already established as part of the standard. It makes it easier for me to design the API, it makes it easier for me to implement the API, and oh, great, it's also easier for anyone to actually use the API. So if you focus on models and sharing, this is just a matter of having one referenceable OpenAPI schema that's plugged into the right API editing tool. Tools like Stoplight, that's my personal favorite, but there's also Insomnia by Kong. They're providing now, in addition to editing, collaboration tools, understanding this challenge of API standardization and the importance of making it easy to share content across each other. Now, there are other benefits to API standardization that you can do to incentivize teams to adopt the standards, such as, well, you won't have to create your own libraries and your own documentation. There may be one centralized team to facilitate the standards, and then also a team to create the documentation and the libraries, ideally, so that A, the documentation is centralized and consistent for your external developers, B, teams can just focus on designing their APIs and not worry about any challenges with the documentation itself. And yes, there are already tools to auto-generate the docs and auto-generate the SDKs. But quick tip, be ready for some challenges when taking a valid OpenAPI schema and plugging it into these. You may find teams that are really good at API design going by your standards, and oh, the standards include rules around polymorphism, which is 100% supported by the OpenAPI schema, but it turns out your library generator doesn't actually work very well with polymorphism. I've seen this in practice. I'm personally a huge fan of polymorphism and API definitions, but library generators really don't like them, and sometimes we have to compromise. At many places we give warnings, sorry, you can't apply certain rules of polymorphism to your APIs because unfortunately, it's just not going to work with our libraries. So be ready for that. These teams may have valid schemas. They may have designed their APIs well, but you may have missed a spot in your standards. They remind people we have other tools farther down the pipeline. And if we're going to generate the docs for you, you have to make sure your schema handles those as well. Of course, any good API strategy involves an underlying API gateway. This is really funny to observe if you start an OpenAPI standard kind of late in the game, because teams will also have different underlying infrastructures. And then when it comes to rate limiting, which is usually easily enforced by an API gateway, if they have different API gateways, if they have different means of rate limiting, I've frequently seen ways of bypassing rate limiting. It's very difficult to enforce rate limiting when the infrastructure isn't consistent. But if early on you can recommend the same tools under the same gateway, often these tools plug into particular gateways anyways, ideally, yeah, rate limiting is going to be easier to manage. So is monitoring and analytics. You may also find that your data science team is going to be, in practice, a very strong advocate of API governance and API consistency. Because for them, until they have API consistency and a consistent API gateway, they might have some custom code for analytics, for data logging, for every API. Certain APIs will be better at logging than others. And for the data science team, it's going to be just a lot more work. Unless you have the right gateway with built-in API monitoring, built-in analytics, or good plugins that every team is adopting simultaneously, and yay, your analytics team is going to love it, and they have less work to do, and you're going to love it because you actually have reliable data. So these are the basics of getting started. We can see how tools have now been positioned for scale. Taking your API editors that can be used for design first principles, applying a linter to really enforce API governance, just taking it one level beyond Swagger, getting these things into your CI/CD pipelines. But what else can we do? Although API governance isn't entirely new, with it becoming a more and more prevalent challenge in the last 4 years, I've seen a big rush to automate, to provide better automation tools, as we had seen since the formation of the OpenAPI initiative. So the tooling that we're talking about today, Linters, many of them are still kind of fresh, and there's a lot of opportunity to do more. I encourage everyone who's involved in governance to really think outside the box. You've seen other talks, you have other initiatives. What else can you do to make this process easier? We found various decorator tools that just generally make it easier to plan your APIs. If you align that with your standards, it can help. Like, we know that most of our API endpoints, even for design-driven APIs, are ultimately standard CRUD operations on top of API models. So if you can auto-suggest API models, and then I think Axway has this is a script I wrote if you're not using Axway, to just auto-generate your endpoints off of your models, great. Makes it even easier. Just go and grab a model, auto-generate your endpoints, and now you have an API design that's design-driven based on use case and is already going to work with the other APIs you have. Let's talk about other tools we can do to help make your Swagger schema more aligned. Certain teams have encountered challenges where they want to move to the next version of their API, get it aligned to standards, but their current OpenAPI schema was basically loosely defined, as in every property is a string. So what can you do there? Well, there are tools to help to suggest, kind of map based on the names of your properties and generate a semi-strongly typed schema to give you a head start. Various Swagger inflector tools I find can really help with this to make those teams that are trying to get aligned to the standards get a slight head start. I've also seen tools to encourage, watch out for backwards compatibility, just various open source tools that hopefully will become more and more baked in the tooling of our API gateways within those CI/CD pipelines to check, are you meeting our standards? Are you violating backwards compatibility? There are many open source tools around which I encourage you to support, and then in time, hopefully they'll get more solidified, more baked inherently into the gateways. And then coming back to those linters, we've seen how the process of designing APIs can actually literally be done with an interface today. In general, when there's JSON, when there's static JSON, when there's static YAML, you can put an interface on top of it. Many of our app manifests today are just done through web forms. Now you can actually design APIs via forms and just enter what do you expect the models to be, what do you expect the endpoints to be. Can we do that for linters? The linters are in fact just JSON or YAML representations that plug into your API editors to enhance the checks that they do. When I first created this presentation, Stoplight hadn't yet launched it, but yeah, Stoplight is actually going that direction now. So they have actually created an interface that you can visually design your linter to enforce your standards. So we can continue to make it easier and easier to plan your standards, to implement your standards, and to abide by those standards through open source tooling and through better integrations with other API tools that we have. All right, I want to make sure we have at least 5 minutes, so I will stop at that. Thank you all for your time, again, through tooling and through Magic of OpenAPI. So hopefully we will get more and more consistent APIs from everyone. Thank you all again for putting up with me for half an hour. Any questions? Sorry, can you repeat that? Oh, shared models? Oh, to elaborate on that. Yeah, so the idea of the shared models is, if you have different product teams, like let's say over on Google Workspace. Obviously, a Google Doc will have certain differences from a Google Sheet, and Google Slides will have certain differences, but fundamentally they're all files. It would be nice to be able to upload a file and get the same kind of return back. You may, when you have to inject content in the files, expect a different structure, but it's nice to be able to upload a file, to share a file, to download a file, to perform common operations on a file. And that helps when you have everything under at least some sort of underlying, file representation. So we can see how when you have a model, the endpoints built off that model will be pretty consistent, but more importantly, the models are going to be the inputs and outputs. They're going to be the outputs of your GET requests. They're going to be the request bodies of your POST and PUT requests. And so when they're consistent, when I'm getting the output of a GET request from, say, Google Slides, There are times maybe, say, a conversion process, or you need to perform some operation and upload elsewhere and say, maybe I take the content from Google Docs and I use it in Google Drive, and they are, in ways, different APIs. Well, it's nice that the models are the same. I can take the output of one API, uses the input of another API, even if they're different products. The way that we generally encourage this is to say, in our standards, don't just have requirements for your design APIs, but say, let's take our models and establish that certain models in use should be our standard. Please use this model rather than create another similar looking model. I've also found it's tricky to do, but you can reasonably, in the CI/CD process, auto-detect an issue. The semi-automated process is to just detect in any new API, is there visibly a new model that hasn't been used before, trigger an alert. Your centralized team can take a look at this and say, okay, we see a new model that calls for a review. If there is no new model, we can just let this new API automatically go live. But if we detect a new model, let's go and review, should this be part of our standard? Or hey, is this similar enough to another model that we should actually go back to that team and say, before you launch your API, don't go and reinvent the wheel. Just use this model we've already established as part of the standard. Anyone else? I would have expected from those who had worked at like Google, IBM, Meta, Microsoft, we've been talking casually this morning, and they're all like, yeah, way easier said than done. A lot of war stories here. It is easier said than done, but it is also easier if you're at a place that's just running into the problem recently. It's best to work on this now, because it's much harder for teams that already have gone into certain habits, already have released inconsistent APIs, to suddenly have to get in alignment. I've been at places where they are, even in principle, supportive of standards. It just takes so long because due to backwards compatibility, I'm not going to tell a team, you need to adopt our standards immediately in your current APIs. You have to coordinate with them on a whole next major version API release. And that can take years for certain teams to get to the point that they're ready for their next version API. When they do it, they'll be happy to work on the standards. But it just gets harder, even if you have in principle support, the longer it takes for you to really get this started. All right, I think we have a couple more minutes. Is there any other questions? All right, otherwise I will be around if anyone wants to sync with me afterwards. Thank you all again.